Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, full disclosure. I voted for Boris Johnson to be Mayor of London in 2008. I am, despite sometimes appearing perhaps to the contrary, I'm not a tribal follower of politics. I know it's desperately unfashionable, and I can't, in the current circumstances, conceive of voting for a mainstream Conservative politician. I think I could probably vote for Dominic Grieve, but the austerity stuff casts a very long and dark shadow over my current contemplations. I do find increasingly, as we read about disabled people and the privations visited upon people who are already poor, I know that an awful lot of people who voted for these policies, Lib Dems as well as Conservatives, and won't have been aware of what they were ushering in. But just on a very, very personal level, I got my first Tory boy tweet coming in. I don't know anymore whether that's meant as a friendly joke or a genuine jibe. But I do have a problem with that. But you have to get over it. You can't spend your entire political life basing your decisions today on things that happened yesterday. You just can't. You have to have a degree of notice paid to what happened yesterday, certainly in the context, I think, more so, oddly, of personal conduct. I think it's more of a signifier of future behaviour than past votes. But I mention all of that because I think it's important, in the words of Taylor Swift's latest single. I think sometimes we do need to calm down, almost in the words of Taylor Swift's latest single. I, as you know, find Boris Johnson morally repugnant. Politically, I find him fascinating. And I think the reason I find him morally repugnant has a lot to do with the baggage that I carry from my own childhood, a Catholic upbringing, very, very moral instruction. I'm proud of it. I like it. I'm pleased with the influences that it exerts upon people, but it's just a point of view. It doesn't give me the right. I mean, you might think that cheating on your wife is perfectly acceptable behaviour, and it's up to the wife to deal with it. It's nobody else's business. I'm not being facetious. I genuinely fully understand that point of view. One of my closest friends abides very, very closely to the rather French attitude, actually, that the personal life, private life, has no bearing whatsoever upon political performance. But I mentioned that I voted for Boris Johnson in 2008, despite the fact that it is an albatross that dangles around my neck and is often cited as evidence by Jeremy Corbyn's most ardent admirers that I am secretly a sort of Ian Duncan Smith acolyte, or secretly a friend of the far right. I voted for Boris Johnson to be Mayor of London in 2008, and it was before Ken Livingstone went all Hitlery as well. So I don't even have that excuse. I liked Ken Livingstone. I enjoyed his mayoralty. I thought his speech on the morning after the July the 7th terror attacks was genuinely incredible. Occasionally you look at politicians, and if you've got an ego as overdeveloped as mine, you find yourself imagining what you might have done in the same circumstances. But Livingstone spoke raw that day, and he spoke, and I don't mean this to sound divisive or in any way exceptionalist, but he really spoke for London, not for the country. He did speak for the country as well, but this is my town, this is my home, has been since I was 19. And like an awful lot of people who've made their lives in massive cities, huge cities, there is a culture to a huge metropolitan bustling city, whether it's ancient Rome or modern London. And Livingstone just got it. He really did. Never more so than on the mornings after the July the 7th terror attacks, when I would remind you, because it's an incredible juxtaposition that I think we've sometimes forgotten, we should have been dancing in the streets that day, because it was only about 36 hours previously that we found that our bid to host the Olympics had been successful. You forget, I think. I wouldn't remember that unless I have almost a flashback type of memory of it, because the newsroom where we watched the announcement of the Olympics was just hours later in a state that I pray to whatever God you believe in, as well as the one I believe in. I pray that we'll never see scenes like that in our newsroom again. The memory I have of July the 7th, sorry, I don't know where all this is coming from, actually, but thanks for indulging me. The memory I have of July the 7th, I was very wet behind the ears, and I was on air for 4 hours that morning, and Mrs. O'Brien and I were going through a terrible time at the time, trying to conceive, and we'd had some terrible news that morning, which suddenly, I was worried about holding it together on air, but then, of course, suddenly you're in the moment and you push everything else out of your head for 4 hours. Didn't know how I was going to get home. I ended up sitting in the back of a courier's van, being driven to the outskirts of London where the trains were still running. But I always remember someone telling me that on the gantry, as their traffic was stopped outside London, the gantry just said, "London is closed, turn on your radio." And Ken Livingstone spoke the next morning in a way that I do believe played quite a large part in us picking ourselves up, dusting ourselves down, and doing what, and I apologise if this sounds in any way divisive or exceptionalist, doing what British people have always been rather good at, and getting on with it. And then, in 2008, I voted for Boris Johnson, and I think I know why. I think I just thought, he's fun, he's jolly. I don't have an inbuilt antipathy to old Etonians. I have an inbuilt antipathy to the kind of entitlement and failure or refusal to acknowledge the luck that plays such a huge role in the sort of privilege that a background can play. I have no problem at all with privilege. I don't think you'll be able to ever create a society in which it doesn't play a part. But the people who don't acknowledge that they're lucky, the people who were born on third base and think they've scored a home run, or were born 3-0 up and think they've scored a hat-trick, to bring the analogy home, they're the people that upset me the most, because they tend to ride roughshod over the concerns and cares of less fortunate people, or worse, and we're seeing an awful lot of this at the moment, they whip up people less lucky, less fortunate, less privileged than them into blaming their own lack of wealth or lack of opportunity or lack of influence. They whip them up into blaming it on all the wrong targets, like the BBC, perhaps, or foreign aid, or Brussels, or immigrants, or Muslims, or whatever it may be. You can fill in the gap every morning, can't you? But I voted for Boris Johnson in 2008, and I'm not ashamed of it. I don't think anyone should be ashamed of a vote they cast in good faith, you know. If you cast a vote to hurt other people, then you're probably beyond feeling shame. Again, it's where we are now. An awful lot of people, it seems to me, are making their democratic decisions based upon hurting others, rather than improving life for anybody. Stick it to them, that'll teach them. You lost, get over it. Well, you're supposed to vote to make things better, ideally for everybody. If you can't do it for everybody, then for the people who need it most, ultimately for somebody. But anyway, we are where we are. And it didn't take me long to realise that I shouldn't have voted for Boris Johnson. It was the fire service that made it clear to me. I remember sitting in the studio with a bloke called Brian Coleman, who was head of the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority. But Johnson had already started refusing to talk to me by then, so clearly this wasn't the penny drop moment. Obviously the scales had fallen from my eyes a little earlier. But this chap, Coleman, was talking on air. This is a really interesting episode, actually. I think it had quite a lot to do with my political waking up. This guy, Coleman, was talking about the threats to the fire service, and the fire service at the time were threatening industrial action. Forgive me if I'm a bit sketchy on the precise detail. I don't think I am, but forgive me if I am. And Coleman was talking about Johnson had swore blind they wouldn't close any fire stations or reduce the number of fire appliances on the streets of London by 1. And it was pretty clear that he was going to. And Coleman was kind of trying to defend him. And then the microphones went off. And he said to me off air, "Do you really think?" And he had quite an unpleasant manner. I think you'll let me say that. Firefighters would probably go a little further. "Do you really think that Boris Johnson doesn't know exactly what's going on?" The intimation being that he sends out people like me as his proxies to essentially take all the flack on his behalf. And naive little fella that I was, I didn't think that. I presumed that the people in charge of the detail were slightly at odds with what Boris Johnson was saying in public, and that Boris Johnson just wasn't really across it. But then here was his head of fire emergency planning saying, "Do you really think that Boris Johnson doesn't know exactly what's going on?" And we'd been talking very specifically about the closure of fire stations and the removal from circulation of fire appliances, fire engines in old money. So we I played a bit of a trick on him. I looked up and I said to my studio producer, I said, have we got all that on tape? Because we'll play it out after this break. And this lad Coleman went, puce. I've never seen anyone actually change colour. It's usually in the Beano, isn't it, or something like that. And it was astonishing. We didn't actually have it on tape. We were playing jokes. But it was an astonishing insight. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, yeah, big surprise, James. What sort of a naive little snowflake were you? Politicians and their proxies, pulling the wool over the public's eyes. But for me, genuinely, it was a real fork in the road. It really put me down the don't trust any of them school of thought. And I still don't feel any need to apologise or express shame at the fact that I voted for Boris Johnson. So, in a way today, what I would like you to do is almost bring me back to the place where voting for Boris Johnson didn't seem like such a terrible thing to do. Because I can't criticise you for doing what I did 11 years ago. Maybe, is it going to build a bridge? I don't know. Just can you give me a reason to support Boris Johnson that doesn't involve hurting or annoying somebody else? And for the purposes of this conversation, I'm quite happy to be the whipping boy. Hurting or annoying people like me who are always banging on about how bad racism is and how equality is something we should all aim for and how some of the rich have got too much and the poor haven't got enough. And people like me who don't think you should judge someone because of the colour of their skin or the religion that they were born into. You should judge someone by how they act, how they treat you, how they treat each other, how they look after people who most need to be looked after. Annoying little snowflakes, lefties like me. That's not really a good enough reason to vote for him. Not really, not if you're honest with yourself. But I voted for him in 2008, so why would you vote for him now? 0345 6060 973. And by the end of the hour, maybe I will be apologising and feeling shame at what I did in 2008. But right now, hand on heart, how can I give you a kicking for thinking that it would be a good idea to do something that I did 11 years ago? I don't think I can. Although I should point out for the record that every time I suggest that I'm not going to be able to give anyone a kicking between now and 11 o'clock, events often go in the other direction. I voted for Boris Johnson in 2008, so I can't really call you names if you are thinking of voting for him in the next election, or indeed in the leadership election if you're a Conservative Party member. So just try and tease me, tempt me a little bit closer to where you are and where perhaps I used to be. A quick mention to Matt Sprake, who's just tweeted me. Astonishingly, I suppose it's amazing you were listening at all, Matt, actually. But Matt took that picture I was referring to. He sent me a clipping of the front page of the Daily Telegraph on July the 8th, of course, and the exact wording on the gantry, and Matt took this photograph himself. Avoid London, area closed, turn on radio. Amazing. But not long afterwards, the mayor of London, as was replaced by Boris Johnson, partly because of my vote. So why has he still got yours? 21 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And what I'd really value is a powerful and compelling account why his personal conduct doesn't matter and doesn't have any bearing at all on his suitability to be leader. The bigger problem will probably be pointing at things from his political career, his professional conduct that give you hope that he'd be a good Prime Minister. Claiming that he dealt with the London riots, he didn't come back from holiday for 3 days. And the idea that the Olympics was in any part due to him, I find silly, but maybe you're better qualified than I am to explain why those do deserve to be circled or given a gold star on his curriculum vitae. Let's start off in Southampton. Tony is there. Tony, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello,
I'm new to RBC. I drove to work today as opposed to got the train. So I've listened to your station, have friends who listen avidly to you. First of all, James, I'd like to respond to a great point you made about entitlement and preciousness in the upper middle classes or aristocracy even. Now, yes, Boris, I'm aware of Boris's background and absolutely no resonance there. That I have nothing in common in terms of his background. But, we met someone ultra posh, beyond posh recently, my wife and I, and her question was, you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, weren't you? And his answer was, unforgettable. He said, Ella is born with a whole drawful, darling. And, you know, it was the honesty of saying, that's who I am. And, you know, I think I've never observed that Boris has stepped back from that. He's not denied his...
No, this is clearly my fault. I don't think I'm disputing anything you're saying. I haven't heard him acknowledge the role that luck has played in his life, but I'm interested more in the future, I think, and reasons to be cheerful about the prospects of his premiership.
All accident of birth, you should say. Reasons to be cheerful. I think the country needs someone who's going to execute now, someone who's going to do something, as opposed to, forgive the term, the sort of intellectual masturbation that goes on and that's gone on too long. He will.
This doesn't really. That doesn't really mean anything. What do you think he's going to deliver?
I think you have to also have confidence in the very senior team around him, experienced seasoned team around him.
He hasn't appointed it yet, Tony. I'm sorry if I'm badgering you, but he hasn't got a team around him yet. He's got Linton Crosby, the Australian election guru, pulling all sorts of strings behind the scenes at the minute. But and of course, that people will want jobs in his cabinet. But you know, that he'll have talented colleagues isn't really what I would suggest necessarily is what you want as the primary qualification of your leader.
We live in an imperfect world, and Boris
he's going to be picking his top team from the same pool that Theresa May did.
Well, we don't know that, but I do know...
We do. In the context of the cabinet, we do. You can only choose your cabinet from serving Conservative MPs. I think you can chuck a lord in as well, or a lady, but it's the same pool that Theresa May...
Okay.
110%. So I appreciate what you said is he'll get things done. What things?
Yes. Well, I think we also acknowledge that this country has the best civil service in the world. So
Brexiters don't acknowledge that. Brexiters think the civil service are all traitors and the enemy of their cause. But just let me push you on what he's going to get done, because at the moment you've praised his putative team and you've praised the civil service. You haven't told me anything about him that's admirable.
Well, you mentioned the Olympic Games. The government mission was to deliver a safe and secure Olympic Games. Boris was at the helm.
He wasn't in the government.
Well, he achieved that as Lord Mayor of London.
He wasn't Lord Mayor of London.
My apologies. As Mayor of London, I think he did a sterling job. And I think, you know, I mean,
Sebastian Coe would probably disagree with you in the context of who did the heavy lifting and who did the work, and certainly in the context of who secured the Olympics for London in 2012. The answer is not Boris Johnson. And of course, the Olympics are an exceptional event, so let's pretend it was entirely 100% down to Boris Johnson. That makes him very good at event planning. It means he'd be a good bloke to organise your wedding. Just give me something that proves he could run a country really well from his own past.
I think Brexit is a huge event. Also, I met the man once.
Brexit, you can't really be comparing Brexit to the Olympics, Tony. I appreciate you've not been on before, so I won't haul you over the coals for that. Just from his own past, is because he's had high office as Foreign Secretary and as Mayor of London. What would you point to as evidence that he'll be a good Prime Minister?
I actually don't support him because of his charisma and his...
I'm just going to push you now, because I've got a lot of other people waiting. Yeah. Okay, you think he'll appoint good people. You think we've got an excellent civil service. You met some bloke who was very posh once, and you and your wife liked him, and you think you're not voting for him because of his charisma. So just for the avoidance of doubt, 8 years as mayor, 3 or 4 years as foreign secretary, one of the best-known politicians in the country for as long as most of us can remember. What do you point at as the achievement, the political achievement that qualifies him to be Prime Minister?
Well, you know, if you ask that question of any of the...
Well, I've asked you 7 times now, so if you could just have a crack at answering it, and then we can both get on with our day.
No, I appreciate that, and I thank you for the opportunity to
Go on then, just one thing.
He's got my vote.
Yes, I know he has, but the achievement that you point to as evidence of his quality as a leader.
I think he did a marvellous job as Mayor of London.
Yes, the achievement. The political achievement. So, you know, whether you could point at, I don't know, you could point at a treaty that was signed, or you could point at clean air legislation that was brought in, or child poverty decreasing, or exam grades going. I don't know what, but you must know one thing, because you love the guy.
Well, in the aggravated sense of the word, but actually, I don't love him as such.
No, just one achievement, Tony. One achievement?
Well, achievement is right now that he's mustered the support of so many...
That's not a political achievement, that's a popularity contest, and we all agree that he's popular. So, 8 years as mayor, 3 or 4 years as foreign secretary, other jobs in politics, what do you point at and say, look, give the guy a break? He achieved what, Tony?
Well, I would go back to what I say, that if you...
I'd really rather you didn't, because you haven't said anything yet, so just the achievement.
The achievement of rallying around serving members of Parliament...
But we know he's popular. What's the political achievement, Tony?
But I don't think they voted for his popularity. I think they voted for his...
yes, so what's the achievement, Tony? You can tell me that you can't think of one, and then you can put yourself out of your misery, but until then, I'm going to keep saying, what is the crowning achievement of his political career? Foreign Secretary. Let's forget Mayor. Let's go as Foreign Secretary. What was his best achievement as Foreign Secretary?
Well, no comment on that, but I think it's yet to come, James.
Right, there we go. So, nothing. Fingers crossed, everybody. Thank you, Tony. 10:29 is the time. And you know, let me try, actually. I voted for him to be mayor. What did when I look back, I'm not being glib. I could mention the bikes, but Ken Livingstone dreamt them up. They got put onto the streets of London after Boris Johnson became mayor. Maybe he deserves a little bit more credit than I've given him for the success of the London Olympics. Although I suspect it had an awful lot more to do with the people that organised the London Olympics. But that Brian Coleman bloke I mentioned to you earlier, he, like Steve Norris, is one of the people that has subsequently said publicly that Johnson's deputy mayors did all the work, all the detail-based analysis. But, you know, there are a lot of Tonys out there. You're sort of sounding middle class, educated, very fluent and fluid, very good with phrases and slogans, and utterly bankrupt when it comes to answers to the question of what the man's ever done to give you faith in his political skills, not in his popularity or his charisma or his ability to hone a well-turned phrase or tell a joke, leaving his personal life out of it. There's a man currently on hunger strike in this city because his wife is in an Iranian jail cell, we think in solitary confinement. We know herself on hunger strike. She hasn't seen her daughter for years. She has been imprisoned by a rogue regime that the West is currently contemplating going to war with. And when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he made her situation worse. It's 10:30. In 2008, I should get a T-shirt printed, I voted for Boris Johnson. I realised quite quickly that I probably shouldn't have done, not least when he was revealed to be telling enormous fibs about his plans for the London Fire Service, which I considered to be quite important. He also campaigned on a pledge not to close a single ticket office on the London Underground. Now, again, it's not a black and white issue, that. I just felt, as someone who uses the London Underground a lot, that having people in the ticket offices was helpful. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I didn't think when he promised he wouldn't close a single one that we'd end up closing every single one. I mean, not just closed a few after pledging not to close any, but closed every single one. But the London Underground is still running. I don't think anyone would claim it's improved by not having ticket staff, but it's still running. And that is, I suppose, if you had to describe Boris Johnson's peculiar brand of politics, it is, well, look, it's not actually broken. And I've been in charge for a few. It's Brexit, isn't it? Now what they're telling us about Brexit is, well, look, it's not going to be Armageddon. We survived the Blitz. It's only 3 years ago. You were telling us everything was going to get better. And now the reason it was a good idea to vote for it is that we're not all going to die. That's probably something you could have put on the side of a bus. Vote for me. It won't be Armageddon. Do you know, a Conservative politician said those exact words to me the other night. And they voted for Johnson in the leadership election. So, well, what happens if we actually crash out with no deal? He's clearly flirting with the idea. Well, it won't be Armageddon. Kind of might be if you work in car production or something. But anyway, so the bikes, and I suppose for the avoidance of getting stuck, we should let's pretend that the Olympics were all down to him. So if you've got a big party that needs arranging, he's your man. But if you've got a country that needs running, what would you point to first? And look, you might struggle to do this with any politician, but this is the one that's going to be Prime Minister next, so it's not a morning for whataboutery. What is his greatest political achievement, especially, of course, as Foreign Secretary, because that is one of the great offices of state, and it's a role he occupied most recently. 10:37 is the time. Andrew is in Taunton. Andrew, what are we going to put on the list?
Wincanton, hi. God, calling James O'Brien. This is weird. But anyway, James, I'm not been a great fan, but I think you actually
listen,
very well.
Even I'm getting a little bit bored of the conversation being about me rather than the questions that I'm asking. The same thing happened on Nick's show earlier, but let's crack on with Boris Johnson.
Okay, I actually think he did an okay job as mayor. I don't think it was bad.
Have you always lived in Somerset?
No, London.
Okay, go on.
I went to school with Boris. Not that I was a personal great friend of his, but yeah, I think he did a good job. I think, look, housing, I think he did quite a bit for housing. I think a lot better than Ken Livingstone by all the records state. I think crime did go down under his tenure, whether he was directly responsible or not. I think he did a pretty good job. He was a very inclusive mayor.
Was he?
You know, all this apparently so. Everybody I speak to in London, from all walks of life, thought he was great and valued what he tried to do in London. I mean,
that's probably a reflection, perhaps more on your social circle than upon Boris Johnson's successes. But certainly, listen, I'm not going to argue with you because I voted for him. He brought all sorts of people that you might not have expected to vote for a Conservative to be mayor. I mean, I can't allow the crime things to go unpassed because whenever Sadiq Khan is criticised for rising crime figures, I always point out that the national government bears responsibility for policing. So while Boris Johnson might have had a decent result on crime, it was the national government that would have been, of course, responsible for that, and the national government was Labour. But you know, I'm not splitting hairs. I'm just trying to be a little bit detail-led. What about as Foreign Secretary?
We were talking about as Mayor of London, right?
No, Foreign Secretary. I said just before you came on, I said that it was the great office of state and the job he's most recently held, and of course the only job he's held at national level.
Correct, and I think he failed at that, to be honest.
Well, I can't argue with you on that. This isn't going to be going viral, Andrew.
He did fail, and I'm hoping that...
Why do you think he failed? And you know him better than most people listening to this programme.
No, well, I went to school at a really young age, but...
Well, I mean, I know the people I went to school with better than you do, so it's a fair observation. I'm not claiming that you're his bosom buddy, but why do you think he failed? And I would add so spectacularly, you don't have to go along with that.
Yeah, I think he believed in his own immortality, almost, as it were. I really thought... He thought he was this, because he's a very intelligent, highly educated, well-read, etc., that he thought he could wing it and go straight in there, and it would all be happiness and light. And sadly, that great office of state needs a lot more thought. Now,
do you not think Prime Minister does?
Well, yeah, exactly. I'm hoping, I mean, looking at that disaster the other night on TV, I mean, none of them came off with any brilliant light, although he kept quiet as much as he could to avoid any embarrassment.
Just try and bring me back to how I felt when I voted for him. Give me something that I can sort of hang my hat on.
I don't know. He's a great... he's a great character, and a lot of us thought this great character would come in, and I think he did
Lynch, but you wouldn't necessarily want her to be Prime Minister.
Well, listen, Tony Blair's got a great character. You know, I mean, with all due respect to Tony Blair, look what happened there. I mean, you mentioned his name now, and he's pilloried across Britain, you know, and you can say that with a lot of people.
Yeah, but well, you can, but I mean, and Blair, of course, will have Iraq hanging over him for the rest of his days. But I can't help thinking. I was looking at some of the coverage of the BBC today that you've just referred to. I can't help thinking that, you know, the owners of the Daily Telegraph, the owners of the Sun, the owners of the Daily Mail probably had more to do with how Tony Blair is perceived and with how Boris Johnson is perceived than the actual actions of either man.
There's the media question again. On which side are you on? I mean, if you
there's no question about which side they're on. Boris Johnson's been getting £270,000 a year from the owners of the Daily Telegraph, and every front page in, well, certainly in the last couple of weeks, has been essentially a sort of extension of his leadership bid. Today, the headline, Johnson hatches plot to knock out Gove. Tory front-runners supporters could vote tactically as they hope for Hunt in round 2. So you just quite like the cut of the man's jib, and I can't argue with that, because I did 11 years ago.
I do like, yes, I do.
Pickaninnies with watermelon smiles? Is that inclusive?
that was
bank robbers?
Yeah, that was silly.
Bank robbers, letterboxes, is that, I mean...
but do you forget? You forget something about that statement now.
Maybe.
Do you remember he was the man who actually said we should not ban the burqa?
No, I don't forget that. I'm talking about him being the man that said they looked like bank robbers and letterboxes.
At the same time, he was.
But that means he just insulted hundreds of people, but he didn't want to ban the burqa. That doesn't really follow. But the second bit has nothing to do with the first bit. I don't want to ban shell suits, but if I spoke incredibly rudely about everybody who wears shell suits, I would be incredibly rude.
Correct.
Yeah.
It is rude. It was probably offensive to many, many people about it, but the point that he was trying to make at the time was this is the problem with him. I'm not looking for the problems with him, Andrew. I'm looking for the benefits. You see, I personally think that the burqa is an appalling garment, much more than a garment. But I can generally explain it without insulting everybody that wears it, personally insulting them. Or indeed, whether deliberately or not, encouraging, shall we say, less educated people to march up to these women in the street and abuse them or tear off their headgear. I'm incredibly, I think I'd use the word passionate critic of that piece of headgear. But I've always managed to express myself without either inciting hatred of people who wear it or indeed offending on a personal level, as opposed to the decision that they've taken, the people that wear it. But, you know, we're nearly there. We'll get something. Michael's in Hastings. Michael, what have we got?
Well, he actually set up Team London. No one's been mentioning this. And Team London were responsible for supporting a huge number of charitable groups, including the Kindness Offensive that gave away over 60,000 toys to children in need.
Well, this is good. This is good stuff.
Then he actually did that. When the Kindness Offensive needed a building, it took him exactly 1 week from letting him know the problem was there to being handed the keys to a building, which was...
This is a field you know a lot about, is it?
Well, I'm a volunteer, and I was there. I saw it happen, and I think that, Team London is one of the biggest volunteer groups in the world. And old age pensioners' trips were...
Do you know, I'm delighted you were listening today. I know nothing about this, and I cover this for a living. It's an indication of how perhaps sometimes the Speak Your Weight machine is nowhere near as popular as the Ghost Train. This is great stuff. So he set up Team London, and it's a massive volunteer organisation that does... I have a slight problem with volunteers and charities replacing what I personally think the state or the government should be doing, but that's a hair split in this context, isn't it? What else can you tell us about Johnson's involvement in it?
Well, he helped to sponsor a double-decker bus that took old-age pensioners to Kew Gardens, helped to get free tickets for old-age pensioners that were on that bus.
You mean he gave public money to it?
No, what he did was he actually endorsed it, and then people jumped in, like Greg's the Bakers and a few other people jumped in and sponsored the events. But it was Boris who actually made the recommendation. He was happy to write letters. He was happy to...
Wicked. So I like this. So this is good. And this might sound like a slightly cheeky question, but it isn't. How does that, do you think, segue into reasons to want him to be Prime Minister?
Well, that's a really good question. And
that's what I'm here
for. I think the answer to that is that you want a Prime Minister that cares about what's happening to people on the ground level.
But he's offered tax cuts to the richest people in the country and nothing to the poorest.
But the idea that he's more than a politician, like when I spoke to him about this problem at the
I'm just going to steer you back to the tax cuts point.
Well, that's...
So tax cuts for the rich, charity for the poor, is what I'm getting from this call at the moment.
Well, the charity for the poor is something that hasn't been mentioned up until now.
And I'm delighted it's on the list, but so we say the sheen is coming off it slightly when I remind you that he's currently promoting tax cuts for the rich.
Well, this is this whole trickle-down promise, isn't it?
No, if you cut taxes for the rich, it just trickles down to their pockets.
Well, I've got to say that's not a corner that I'm too familiar with, so I'm not going to pretend.
No, well, I'm glad you've reminded us that he did some great work in the charity sector, but of course, arguably, if you don't give tax cuts to the rich people, there's a lot less need for charity, isn't there?
True. But these things that he set up, some of them are still existing today.
And I do not mean in any way to denigrate that legacy, but of course, if you're giving tax cuts to the rich, the need for charity increases exponentially. It's how people like Jacob Rees-Mogg can end up calling food banks uplifting, isn't it, Michael?
Well, why do you think he's giving tax cuts to the rich?
To buy their votes, mate, and because he doesn't care about the poor, but he might sponsor the odd double-decker bus to pretend that he does. We're just sort of looking for reasons to be cheerful about the almost inevitable arrival of Boris Johnson in Downing Street, and I've turned off some of my own, some elements of my own moral compass, because I appreciate that can sound terribly sanctimonious at times. We've all got friends that have cheated on their wives, or most people have probably, or cheated on their husbands, told a few fibs perhaps, been a bit cheeky at work, maybe helped themselves to the contents of the stationery cupboard, or spent 143 million quid on a bridge that never got built. Did I hear David Davis describing that as a tiny amount of money earlier today? I think I should double check. God, a dream of the day I'd consider 100-odd million quid to be a tiny amount of money. But reasons to be cheerful. What should we like about him? 10:52 is the time. Does a lot of work for charity. Not really, but, we'll put it down on the list. And does it really matter anymore? Brexit has so completely, choose a verb that isn't a pejorative, changed the nature of British politics, that maybe we have just become a kind of American-style system where whoever is in charge is decided more by a sort of beauty contest type rally-based popularity show. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But I guess I'm trying to reassure myself that it can't go that wrong if we put him in Downing Street. I mean, who else would you put in there? Jeremy Corbyn? Les is in Bexley Heath. Les, what would you like to say?
Good morning, Mr. O'Brien. Thank you so much for taking my call. It's been a long, long time since we've crossed swords. I listen to your show from time to time when I'm in this country. Les,
I'm going to wait for your autobiography, okay? And encourage you to make the point you've rung in to make.
Okay, James, I sent you a copy of my autobiography last year, but I never got a reply.
Carry on, Les.
It's called Swimming with Stingrays, The Other Side of Life.
I do apologise. I was being facetious when I said I was going to wait for your autobiography.
But you've just shot yourself in the foot, because I personally...
No, I completely agree. I was making a joke about how dull you are, and I can't believe that you are actually dull enough to have sent me your autobiography. But let's start again and not talk about crossing swords or autobiographies. You've rung in not to talk about me, I'm sure, Les, but to talk about Boris Johnson.
Well, not particularly, James.
Then I'm afraid you've got the wrong end of the stick. Paul's in Birmingham. Paul, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
I'm one of those pinko-liberal ardent remainers, and I strongly support Boris to be our next Prime Minister.
No, there's a gag coming here of some kind, isn't there?
No, there's not. There's not.
Oh, go on then.
All morning, you've been listing Boris's failings, of which the list is endless.
I haven't really. Sorry, I'm arguing everyone this morning. I haven't really been listing his failures. I've been seeking his successes, and I've been incredibly generous. I think the Olympics he does deserve clearly some credit for, and the stuff that the American gentleman mentioned, I didn't know about the Team London stuff. So I'm being, I think, a picture of probity.
Let's agree that he's failed at many things.
Yeah, I think the Foreign Secretary stuff is pretty serious.
And here he is, surging ahead to be our next Prime Minister, and everyone loves him. Now, Brexit can't be done, I don't think. It's a stupid plan that will never get over the line. We need someone who can fail spectacularly and still come up smelling of roses.
Yes.
So we need Boris to go into Europe, not renegotiate anything, because we've said we won't and they said they won't. Not deal with the backstop, not deal with any of the issues.
So it has to be done by someone who owns it, and this was perhaps the fatal flaw in Theresa May's self-appointed mission, was that there would always be voices saying, yes, but you don't believe enough, and I mean that. That is what they were saying.
That's exactly it.
Yes.
Anyone but Boris is not Brexity enough to persuade the Brexiteers. We need to kill this. You're not Brexity enough. If you just believe
but how much
more,
harm? Well, I mean, this is obviously close to optimism. The idea that it has to be done by somebody that the very, very passionate Brexit supporters would recognise as acting in good faith. They'd think if he can't do it, then maybe it's impossible. But I think, to be kind, I think you overestimate them if you think that they're ever going to admit logic into their reasoning.
It's our only hope. No one is going to do anything. Yeah, I know that's bad from me, who doesn't like him personally, but there's no one else.
Is there no chance that we're wrong and that there is something at the end of the rainbow?
I don't think so.
No.
I mean, you look at the backstop, and we've all read vast amounts about backstop. We've all read about these so-called technological solutions that no one's even signed a purchase order for yet, and it doesn't exist. So you can't solve the backstop. It's just not doable. But everyone will fail.
It's a very interesting report published today by the Irish broadcaster RTE.
Oh, that is fascinating.
About the Good Friday Agreement and North-South cooperation. But then, you can just slide over onto Twitter and you've still got Tory MPs claiming that Article 24 of the GATT treaty will allow us to...
You're right. That report is extremely lengthy and extremely detailed and goes into all the reasons, not just checking lamb coming across the border, but all the other reasons around education and whatnot. And it can't be done.
Waterways.
And so Sajid Javid
the regulations that govern the cleanliness, the hygiene of waterways. How the hell can you have different rules on both sides of a border about what's in water, what's permitted in water? I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see how that shakes down. I'll take your point, and I know it's not tongue-in-cheek, actually, but it is...
100% not. I'm looking at persuading those people I speak to, who are my friends.
You've got to put him in charge. I can't quite come with you because I worry about the damage. But you say we need to have the damage before people see the light. And I say, well, I can't yet do that because I'm not going to be that damaged. And I genuinely worry now about the people who are.
One final point.
Go on.
I think it is going to play out. And we'll see what happens because I think we are going to get Boris. And I hope I'm right and you're not.
Yeah, okay, well, yes, up to a point. I mean, you hope you're right in that the pennies will drop, the scales will fall from people's eyes. Yes, I know you're not saying you hope I'm wrong in the other context, because I do worry about people getting hurt, and I hope you're wrong when you say that the only way people are going to see the light is after they've been hurt. Because I don't know that history's on your side, and certainly the modern... You really think all of these newspapers are going to sort of turn around, put their hands up and say to their readers, actually, it was our fault. We got it all wrong. Don't blame Brussels. Don't blame the EU. Don't blame immigrants. Don't blame Muslims. Don't blame single mothers. Don't blame the unemployed. Don't blame foreign aid. Don't blame feminism. Don't blame gay rights. Don't blame health and safety legislation. Don't blame the nanny state. Don't blame... whatever it may be, faceless unelected bureaucrats. Blame us. We lied to you for 30 years straight, and now we've decided to tell you the truth. I just worry that the lens through which most of us arrive at our conclusions about political realities is a distorting lens, and it's a lens which is highly unlikely to deliver the truth, even if it unfolds as you suggest. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. I'd like to continue with this, but it depends on your appetite. Meanwhile, I'm just going to pop off and read Les's autobiography. I have a problem. Well, I've got several, as you know, but the problem I've got at the moment is a professional one, really. I don't want to spend the next X years or months just sort of lazily lobbing the usual hand grenades, metaphorical hand grenades. Don't phone the police, Nigel. Not real hand grenades. Lobbing metaphorical hand grenades at Boris Johnson. I really don't. It's so exhausting wanting to be wrong all the time, Remember, I said to you, please, God, I'm wrong when I said Brexit will come down to no deal versus no Brexit, and all the people currently claiming that we're going to get a brilliant deal will suddenly start pretending that they wanted no deal all along. It's like I'm Nostradamus. There's no fun in it at all, because it's our country that's crumbling. I'd like to be wrong about Boris Johnson. The best I can say at the moment is maybe he won't actually have that much impact. Or and this isn't a joke. Hopefully it might make you smile, but it's actually not a joke. As a student of Boris Johnson, I think there is some optimism to be derived from the fact that he cannot be trusted at all. So I genuinely find myself feeling a modicum of hope about the future, particularly with regard to the continuing madness surrounding Brexit. Boris Johnson will break his word as comfortably as the rest of us break bread. He will quite happily chuck all the people that get him into Downing Street under the proverbial bus if he thinks it will keep him in Downing Street. A few people have made this point. I'm not passing it off as my own. I think I made it yesterday. I've certainly made it on a couple of stages lately. But you could quite easily, if Boris Johnson's self-interest continues to be the only thing he really cares about, I could see him doing almost anything to hang on to power, including abandoning all the hard Brexit supporters that have got him into power in the first place. Why would he treat them with more respect, honesty, and fidelity than he treats his own wives. Why on earth would Boris Johnson treat Mark Francois with more honesty and fidelity than he treats the two former Mrs. Johnsons? I appreciate, again, I stress, if you're one of those people that thinks personal lives don't matter when you're judging someone's personality, that's fine. I disagree with you very, very strongly. But you'd have to answer that question, and that's perhaps a reason to be cheerful. I don't know. Give me some other reasons to be cheerful. Although I doubt any of you are going to make me as cheerful as Les. Am I going to have to resign that line now? If someone's being a little bit dull and talking not really on the issue that's under discussion. I said, well, look, I'm going to have to wait for your autobiography. Can we move on to the question that I'm at? And then Les comes back with, I sent you my autobiography last year, James, and I didn't get a reply. And you sort of think, I do get sent a few self-published books every year, and I cast an eye over them, and I generally send a thank you letter if it seems appropriate. But that can't happen again. I don't want to resign that line. It's one of my favourites. I'm going to have to wait for your autobiography. Well, I sent you my autobiography last year. Can we clip that up, please? I want to take that home. It's 6 minutes after 11. David is in Woking. David, what would you like to say? Hang on, before you start, have you ever sent me your autobiography?
I'm still writing it, James.
The suspense is killing me, David. Hurry up, will you? For heaven's sake. Now, what did you ring in to talk about?
I'm really concerned. We all call this man Boris, as though we know him. Really, he's not some long-lost friend or brother. The man is a charlatan, a thief and a liar. If he came from a council estate where I come from in Glasgow, the police would be watching him all the time. He arranged to have people beat up. He told lies.
He agreed to help someone arrange to get someone beaten up. It wasn't actually followed through on. I hate this.
James, you also mean that he was talking to a convicted criminal?
I don't think he'd been convicted at the time.
He wasn't, but that shows you the sort of calibre of people that he's associated with.
Well, I've got friends who've been convicted of crime. I mean, listen, you put me
you're
in
not going to be the next Prime Minister.
Well, stranger things have happened. All right, not the next one. Not the next one, I grant you. I'm not here to defend him, and I share all of your concerns about his moral calibre or his utter lack of moral calibre, but that doesn't... And I don't think I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but it doesn't mean he'd be dangerous as a Prime Minister.
Well, of course he'd be dangerous. He almost got a lady killed who was abroad, and he opened his big fat mouth as Foreign Secretary and almost got the man's wife killed. You know, the man is a complete fool. I appreciate sometimes this is an act, but when you do something as Foreign Secretary which endangers the life of a British citizen, there is something wrong there.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my problem is I can't understand why these things don't resonate more. And some mornings, I'm not going to lie to you, David, I come to work and I think to myself, well, I'm going to have to talk not just to and for the people with whom it does resonate, like it resonates with me, because I've got friends and family and colleagues, and they don't seem to care about this stuff as much as you do and as much as I do. And what do we do now? Do we carry on haranguing them? Or do we find some other way of communicating our concerns to them? Or do we, and I hope this isn't the answer, do we fall into the trap of false equivalence and say, well, on the other hand, of course, there are people who aren't troubled by the fact that Boris Johnson got Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's sentence increased and the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom's own words were used by the prosecutors in an Iranian courtroom while increasing the sentence of an innocent woman.
Let's not forget, the man is also a racist. He's calling ladies who wear the burqa letterboxes.
That's not racist. This is mad. Sorry, I'm just doing a red button commentary on the programme. Is that because I am now in the role of devil's advocate or evidence-based journalist, and I'm correcting and critiquing you while you're essentially on an emotional level making points I'd nod along with. But it's not racist to say that someone looks like a letterbox. It's not a reflection upon their ethnicity or indeed their religion, because the conflation of race and religion, I think, is quite confusing. But he was just describing what a garment, very rudely. I think Watermelon Smiles and Pickaninnies was racist. I think there are other things he's done that are racist. Publishing a poem describing your countrymen as being a verminous race, I mean, that's the definition of racism. But again, he'd say, I was editor, I published all sorts of views. It doesn't mean I endorsed them.
No, because at the end, he is giving fuel to the racists. This man is a politician, and he is giving fuel to the racists. Now, if you turn around and say something like that about complete group in society, they look like letterboxes, it's going to become common parliament.
Yes, but
And
it's the garment that makes them look like a letterbox, not the colour of their skin or the. This is what he would argue, and I don't really want to argue with you. I found it vile.
I know.
And I think it was deliberate, and I think it was insightful, and I think it was straight out of the Steve Bannon playbook. But that's not the best example you could give of his racism. And don't bite my head off, all right?
No.
I know you're not going to, actually. Even if he is a racist, why would that make him a bad Prime Minister? It's not as if he's actually going to introduce racist laws.
No, but it's divisive. And at a time when we need our country to be together, especially going through such a turbulent time in one of the most...
But who would be a uniting politician now? I mean, Rory Stewart has been cast in the role of a uniting politician in recent months, and he's got 8 knives in his back from members of his own party this morning.
And that's why we need a general election to settle this once and for all.
Oh, I wish I had your optimism. You think a general election would settle this once and for all? A general election probably wouldn't give a working majority to any party, unless Labour got rid of their leader and put someone decent in the job, of course, and then all bets are off.
I wouldn't say that, to be honest. But in saying that, it would give certainly an air of legitimacy to the Prime Minister, because the next person who's going to come into Prime Minister hasn't even been elected.
No, but then Corbyn will be the one promising that he can go to Brussels and perform a magic spell, instead of Johnson and his supporters claiming that they're the ones that can go to Brussels and perform a magic spell. And eventually everyone's going to start claiming that they wanted no deal all along, even though they never mentioned it for 3, 4, 5, 30 years.
No, James, I think you missed the point. The point is they've been in power for a number of years. So why couldn't they do it up until now? Boris can't pick...
No, I know that. I know. I'm not missing the point. I'm mocking the point. Of course they can't go to Brussels and suddenly wave a magic wand and get 3 years of carefully negotiate. I heard David Davis this morning talking about it as if it's a reputational issue. Oh, Barnier won't want to fail. Barnier succeeded. His job was to get 27 countries to agree to something that the British Prime Minister, through her negotiating team, also agreed to. And everybody misses this point. It's almost as weapons-grade ignorance, this, as the nonsense that's been spouted and spluttered about general agreement on trade and tariffs, Article 24, paragraph 5 thereof, which literally nobody who's used the phrase GATT 24 in the last 2 years has ever flipping read. Clearly, that 10 years business that Rees-Mogg comes out with, do you know what that is? Yeah. In the treaty, it talks about a reasonable amount of time during which you could retain a status quo while two parties work towards a new trade agreement. And then there's another document, which is an accompanying document to GATT, and the accompanying document tries to define what a reasonable amount of time is, and it says it should not exceed 10 years. So 2 parties negotiating either a customs union, which these people have ruled out, or a full trade agreement, which is more or less impossible without some form of regulatory alignment, which they've also ruled out, will be allowed to carry on trading as we trade now for 10 years. It's based on an incredible misunderstanding of the facts, but of course it's delivered in a patrician drawl, and it's repeated on Twitter, and it's halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Ian Dunt wrote about this in May of 2018, and he picked it apart with the help of people who actually work or have worked for the World Trade Organization. But you're unlikely to get that popping up on your Facebook feed, paid for in a promoted advert by a mysterious foreign source. It's coming up to 11:15. 0345 6060 973. I mean this. I'm at my most optimistic about a Boris Johnson premiership when I reflect upon the fact that ultimately self-interest becomes the national interest. The longer he wants to stay in Downing Street, the harder it will be for him to continue to inflate balloons of bilge and float them over Britain. Farage can carry on heckling and talking nonsense from the sidelines, but Johnson will actually have to deliver, and he will have to keep the country ticking over. And that might mean that he actually starts telling the truth. He might actually have to. Stop laughing at the back. And at least Christine can remember why she voted for Boris Johnson. I voted for him because Ken Livingstone had a ridiculous scheme for a tram along the Uxbridge Road, which would have damaged a lot of green areas and was totally unnecessary, as there are 3 buses on this route already. I kind of get that, actually. We sometimes get a bit carried away with what we think people vote for and against, but localism is probably quite a good thing. I voted for Boris Johnson in 2008. And I've mentioned this before. You can tell I've mentioned it before. I can't remember mentioning it before, but I often get hit over the head with it by the Corbyn fan base. It's complete evidence that all of my concern about people less fortunate than myself is fraudulent, and all I really want is a tax cut, which is why I want the Tories in power forever. Yeah, I know. I don't know who's madder, the far right or the far left. I've got a piece in the TLS this week, a review of that book I mentioned to you, the history of the modern Labour Party. It tracks Corbyn's rise to the top. I'm quite pleased with the piece, actually. It's a book review of David Cogan's book, The Power and the Glory. But I really, really learnt a lot. I'll tweet you a link to it. I mean, it's all right. It's not up there with Les's autobiography, but it's a cracking read. 90 minutes after 11 is the time. Reasons to be cheerful. Praise for Boris Johnson. And I mean, if you're just tuning in and you think, here we go, James just sort of queuing people up and then mullering them, I just argued with the last bloke. The last bloke was attacking Boris Johnson on a lot of the lines that I have used myself in the past. And I wasn't defending him necessarily, but I was certainly correcting David on some of the things that he said. I'm happy to do that. Not every day, but, you know, it's not every day that you're picking a new Prime Minister. Or, I beg your pardon, it's not every day that just over 100,000 people who've paid money to be members of the Conservative Party get to pick a new Prime Minister. The number you need, if you want to add to this list, this glittering list of Boris Johnson's achievements, and I do think it's fair to suggest that they should really be cancelling out the negatives by now. But it doesn't seem to matter. And the reason I keep mentioning that I voted for him in 2008 is if I'd really dug, and I was doing this for a living back then, so there was not that much excuse not to dig. If I'd really dug, I probably would have known enough not to vote for him. And I didn't, so I can't really criticise you unless you have dug and you still like what you found. Andrew's in... I don't know how to pronounce it, but Vevey. I know it's in Switzerland. It says so on the screen. It's Vevey in Switzerland. Andrew, what would you like to say?
I just want to say I met with Boris 3 years ago. We had dinner.
Yes.
There were 6 of us at dinner in Chelsea. He's a perfectly affable bloke. I don't think he'll do a bad job. I think he'll do a good job. But my question is, with all of the chat that's going on and all of the newspapers...
hang on a minute. Before you ask me a question, why do you think he'll do a good job? What do you point at as the precedent for that? I fully appreciate his excellent company. I agree with that, actually. I remember a couple of times he'd be cycling down Charing Cross Road and he'd see me scuttling home and he'd shout, "Hello, comrade," from across the road. And it made you feel temporarily a little bit special. I'm embarrassed to admit that. So I know he's good company. I know he's affable. But when you say you think he'll do a very good job, what would you point at as proof?
Well, when I was living in London, when he was the mayor of London, the situation improved in London.
What situation?
Well, certainly the traffic situation got a lot better. We found that the buses certainly went wrong, and then he put them right when he realised he'd bought the wrong type. The tubes were substantially...
Hang on, just run me through that again. He realised he'd bought the wrong type of buses, and you're reaching for that as proof of him being an effective politician?
No, I'm not reaching for that.
Oh, good. Well, what are you reaching for?
I'm not reaching for anything.
Well, you have to. You just said he'll do a good job, and I'm saying, what do you base that on?
I based it on the fact that he ran London for two stints, and that London was perfectly good throughout that process. We managed to put on a very, very good games, which went incredibly well in one of the most complicated...
But I mean, in the context of a political achievement, I mean, they managed to put on a very good games in Rio de Janeiro and Athens as well. But in the context of a political achievement, what would you...
So if you, James, if you don't
Andrew,
think that putting on an international event such as the Olympics in one of the largest cities in the world, and certainly one of the most complex from a traffic point of view, getting every agency to work together.
I've already agreed to pretend that was down... We can pretend that was down to him, but it's not really a political achievement. It's an event organisation achievement.
Well, in which case you don't really understand politics.
Well, you're probably right, Andrew. You're probably right. So let's chalk that up, and you can educate me now. What's his greatest political achievement as Foreign Secretary?
He was there for an incredibly short period of time. I don't think he had a great...
Long enough to make Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's life a hell of a lot worse, and quite possibly shorter. But just give me anything, then.
Well, I was just giving you an example of a very large major event.
Yes, I know he put on he was mayor of London and inherited an Olympics that went very well and was organised, most people concede, by Lord Coe. But we can pretend he achieved that, That was in 2012. It's now 2019. He's been in the front line of British politics for every one of the intervening 7 years. And look, you know what? I'm bored now. No, you're absolutely right. You can't name anything, and nor should you have to. It's not why you rang in. You rang in to ask me a question, which is a slightly odd...
I asked you...
Yeah, so go ask.
Well, why not? So it's a very, very simple question,
yes.
And that is, having listened to this programme for a number of years and enjoy it thoroughly,
good man.
It would be fascinating to see what you would do in the event that we do have a managed no deal, or indeed any...
That doesn't mean anything.
Let me finish. If in the event that we have a no deal...
Yes.
And the world is not a disaster, and our economy continues to grow, and our unemployment rate does not fall, and we continue to have drugs in our hospitals, will you openly on air say, I'm really sorry I got it wrong?
Crikey, I'll be opening champagne every day for the next 10 years, Andrew.
Excellent. Will you send me a case?
Well, certainly not, no.
Oh, well, why not?
Oh, because I provide you with entertainment. I provide you with entertainment every day. Surely a man of your upbringing would know that you're supposed to be sending me tokens of gratitude, not the other way round. 24 minutes after 11. That's the umpteenth time I've said I really want to be wrong. I'm not even going to ask you what a managed no deal means, because it's just getting boring now. You don't know. I know you don't know. We'll spend 5 minutes pretending that you think there might be an answer to the question, but we all know there isn't an answer to the question. Up with GAT24. Tommy's in Dublin. Tommy, what have you got?
How you doing, James?
Well,
Lovely to speak to you again.
That's a figure of speech, Tommy. You don't want to know. You don't want to know how I'm doing. I tell you what, I'm still glowing from a weekend in Dublin, so I'm doing all right. What have you got?
Yeah, I was just thinking it probably ties into your kind of self-interest point, is that one thing you can definitely say about Boris Johnson is he's very pragmatic. I mean, the man can write two positions on a binary question and is quite able to flip from one to the other depending on which way the wind blows.
Yeah.
And not all the time, but sometimes that can be a strength. Now,
yes, I completely agree with you. Actually, it's the opposite of tribalism, which is the thing I get most exercised about at the moment. It's people who will never change their minds. Oddly, he's in many ways the finest living example of a politician who'll change his mind according to whichever way the wind is blowing.
Exactly, and
that is a strength. I sounded facetious then. In some areas, in some ways, from some perspectives, that is a strength. And if he's changing his mind because of the national interest, and if the national interest is so closely allied with self-interest because he is Prime Minister, then I think that works, actually, as a plus.
It may, but as you said, you could equally turn it into a negative as well, depending if it doesn't align with, for example, if he looks at it and decides, actually, it's very pragmatic and very doable now just to draw a line down the Irish Sea,
yes,
for example, for the border to solve it, as some people argue, and it would, but I would think that anything that Northern Ireland wants, the SNP in Scotland won't be too far behind saying, well, we want that
this
too.
is the danger. I suppose that what we're saying is he changes his mind, he blows in the wind, and if he's doing it for short-term pragmatic reasons, then the long-term consequences could be terrifying. And then, of course, you have to bring in, a lot of people do, I hope unfairly, I'm sure I've done it myself for the record, the Trump comparisons, and you realise that self-interest and national interest are not necessarily allied when the self-interested party becomes the leader of a nation. You can feed your self-interest by telling the nation enormous lies that damage the national interest. So I don't think Trump will do that for my money.
Exactly, Johnson, and also the short-term interest may be not too far aligned with the medium and long-term, as Theresa May has proved over her premiership. But when you asked the question, it was pretty much the only thing I could put my hands on was possibly pragmatism.
Yes, I mean, I again, people might suspect I'm being facetious. I'm really not. I mean, this is our country. We all have to live here. You'd be nuts. I always remember the very first time I realised this was when Ed Balls was Chancellor. And the economic figures would come out, and they weren't great. And I used to sit there thinking, how do you deal with that when you're Ed Balls? You're shadow Chancellor, he was, sorry, not Chancellor. And I just sort of think, because it very much ties in with the chap from Switzerland's question. This sort of, I spared him the observation that if things sort of don't go that badly, it's not evidence that Brexit was a good idea, because Brexit was supposed to make everything better. But if things don't go that badly, then everyone should be happy. people who thought that they were going to go badly should be relieved. I suppose people who thought that things were going to go better should be cross. So oddly enough, if Brexit is not a complete catastrophe but is demonstrably worse than the current status quo, the only people who should actually be cross should be people who voted for Brexit. The rest of us should be relieved that the damage hasn't been as dire as it could have been. But that's probably too logical for the current climate. The point being, of course, that you do find yourself beginning to wonder, what is the national interest? When the economic figures come out and Ed Balls was Shadow Chancellor, I used to sit here and think, I said to you, I think it was another one of those little moments on my path to political consciousness. You can't be pleased. Even if you hate every fibre of the Conservative Party, or if you hate, or you think you hate, because it's not really a logical position to hate everyone in a party, especially these days when you've got such conflicting people in the same parties, or you hate every fibre of the Labour Party. How do you feel when the economic figures that come out are bad and the other lot are in charge? Do you celebrate? This is Brexit in a nutshell, in a way. I don't understand why anyone would think, whether it's Andrew in Vevey in Switzerland or elsewhere, if the country does okay, why would anyone be sad, mad or cross about it? It's as if, tribalism is supposed to make us wish harm upon our neighbours. I don't get that. I never will. And it puts me slightly at odds with the current political landscape, to be honest with you. So I keep saying to you again and again and again and again, please, God, let me be wrong. We need to, I've got a lovely little bit of theatre to share with you in the moment, based on the Boris Johnson Olympics claim. Incorrigible FCA is very cross. He says, don't just accept that he delivered the Olympics. Doing so is to denigrate those who did. And here's what the head of the Olympic Delivery Authority told the Institute for Government about Johnson's involvement with the 2012 Olympics. And it suggests that all he did was some cosmetic changes to the work that had already been put in place. But that's a clip. That's a little clip. That's an excerpt, a cut from a massive report that you've also sent me a link to. And I was just looking at the contents of the report, and there is a little subsection in the introduction. This is Making the Games, What Government Can Learn from London 2012, as published by the Institute for Government. And I'm just looking at the introduction, and there is actually, very early on, high up, I haven't looked at it yet, there is a little bit headed politics. And I am going to find that bit, headed politics, and I'm going to read it to you without checking it, if I can find the flipping thing, and we'll see what it says about the politicians, if you like, who were responsible for delivering, because the Olympic Delivery Authority was set up long before Boris Johnson became mayor, and that is the biggest thing on his list at the moment, as cited by a few callers, and including one, and I really think this is important, actually, because it started happening to me quite a lot. How will you feel if Brexit isn't that bad? And obviously I have quite a personal connection with it, because work-wise and career-wise I've become quite closely associated with scepticism about Brexit. If it's not that bad, I feel a degree of relief, but it still was a bad thing to do. You don't get to win this historic political argument by saying, as a Conservative MP said to me the other night, well, it's not Armageddon, is it? If it's in any way worse than what we currently have and you can't tell me what's got better, you still lose. It's just a massive sigh of relief from people like me that people haven't lost their jobs, and I mean the job they've currently got. I don't mean, well, the car company's shut down in Sunderland, but they're all driving Ubers now, so the employment figures haven't really moved much. I mean intelligent analysis of the facts, leading you to conclude that things have actually got better. You've got more money in your pocket. You've got more protections from exploitative employers at work. You've got more protections from sharp practice in the delivery of food or in the abattoir industry. You need to point at things that are better, that we couldn't have done without leaving. You sit there and say, well, you're not dead, James. Ha, ha, ha. I mean, you're going to do it anyway. I know you are, but it's yourself that you're lying to, not really me. And now we'll do it. Here you go. So, vision, politics, and what's the one underneath? I promise I'm so bad with the computer that I'm going to use the mouse and the whole page. Or institutional design and government. Here it is, politics. First two words. Institute of Government. And this is my curse in life. Here it is, some evidence-based analysis, and I'm going to get halfway through this, and it's going to say something like Boris Johnson was an absolute legend, although in slightly more bureaucratic language. So let's go. Political leadership was a precondition of the Games happening and, as in other major public sector projects, a potential source of risk. Politicians like Tessa Jowell and Ken Livingstone, using the new position of Mayor of London, provided critical leadership for the project, building coalitions, persuading colleagues and participating in marketing and promotional campaigns to keep the public on board. The Olympics were notable for the cross-party support they enjoyed and for the continuity of political personnel, which eased the two changes of administration. That was created by building an atmosphere of transparency and trust between government and opposition, with regular briefings by civil servants. The IOC make opposition support a precondition of bidding, something that would not be replicated for other projects. But the Olympic experience underlines the value of political continuity and preventing major project delivery from becoming a political football. So the expert analysis of the Olympics is that, thanks largely to the efforts of Tessa Jowell, Ken Livingstone and the civil service, it wasn't turned into a political football. And supporters of Boris Johnson today have pretty much offered that up as the only political football with which they can pretend to have scored a goal when answering the question of what his political achievements have actually been. And I'll retweet that from I Am Incorrigible's account, because you may want to go through it and find things that don't support the suggestion that crediting Boris Johnson with delivering the Olympics is, well, at best a little bit hyperbolic and at worst downright daft. Here is the head of the Olympic Delivery Authority talking about it as well. By the time construction began, the 2008 London mayoral election had taken place. In spite of the potential for change in the Olympic programme that this created, in practice, the handover from power from Ken Livingstone to Boris Johnson altered little. John Armitt, the head of the outfits, recalls, "We went from one mayor to another without a hiccup." And the analysis by the Institute of Government continues, "Those changes that did take place were largely cosmetic." So, just like the bikes, he inherited it and just happened to be in the job when it all went off well. And the reason why it went off well was because of all the people that had secured the bid and put in the groundwork to deliver the Games. And that's just me, all right, reading the thing that I will now retweet so that you can have a proper look at it yourself. And once again, we find that facts, when it comes to Brexit supporting right-wing politicians and their supporters, facts, sadly for all of us, don't quite match up with the feelings. Gary is in Glasgow. Gary, what have you got?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
I think it would be absolutely great if Boris Johnson is the next Prime Minister, not elected, but next Prime Minister. I think.
Why do I suspect you've got your tongue in your cheek, Gary?
Because, well, I'm not necessarily got my tongue in my cheek.
Good.
I'm quite genuine about it, because I do think that having an eaten buffoon such as Boris would eventually mean that Scotland would trigger the event that Scotland could leave the Union, which I think will benefit not just Scotland, but it will also benefit the Union. It will also benefit.
There won't be a Union
Kingdom.
to benefit. You mean you mean what's left of the UK?
Well, I think that people would form a new union, not of subordinates, but of equals. And if this had been a union of equals in the first place, Brexit could never have happened.
I think I understand. The European Union arguably is much more a union of equals than the English-Scottish or the UK Union.
Of course it is.
And that's what Brexiters object to most violently, I think. As my analysis is, what they really, really hate is the fact that we are mere equals in the context of European Union legislation. We're not special.
Yes.
But in the context of English-Scottish Union, we are probably not looking at a union of equals. I don't know quite why you'd celebrate that. I don't want Scotland to leave the Union, personally, just to put it out there. Why do you crave it?
Well, not for those kind of emotional reasons. I do believe that we can have a union of equals, so the United Kingdom could still be a union.
Oh, I see.
But as I say, of equals. So you won't see the tearing up of laws which belong to Scotland. You won't see unequal treatment. So Northern Ireland gets bunged £1 billion and has allowed or discussed an open border, while Scotland doesn't have that. So you won't get the inequality And if we are a union that works together as equals...
I don't know. I'm sorry, mate. I hear you, and no, I hear all of that. Why on earth would having Boris Johnson in Downing Street make any of this more likely?
Because he's so divorced from Scottish people, who they are.
So why would having him in Downing Street make a union of equals more likely?
Because I think that would be the trigger that Nicola Sturgeon would use her mandate in the Scottish government to say that now is the time we want another independence.
Why can't she do that now? Why does she need a different prime minister? I mean, she says it every week. We know she wants another independence referendum. It's the raison d'etre of the entire Scottish National Party. Why would Boris Johnson being in Downing Street make it more likely?
Oh, 1 minute. I think I need to correct you there.
Okay.
It's the opposition that always say that Nicola Sturgeon talks about nothing else but independence.
No, I didn't say that. I said it's the raison d'etre. It's why the Scottish National Party exists, is to campaign for Scottish independence. She also governs... in part, Scotland under devolution. But that's not what I asked. I asked why would that become more likely if Boris Johnson was in Downing Street? Just a short answer, if you would.
Simply an Eton buffoon such
No.
Boris Johnson.
All right, you can't answer the question. It's all right. At least I'm being equal in my... badgering of the witnesses today, because I'm not here to defend Boris Johnson, but there's nothing in his education or his alleged buffoonery, he's many things, I don't know that he's a buffoon, that would somehow make the case for Scottish independence stronger. I don't get it, and sadly it seems nor do you. It's 11:45. It's shot by this morning. Sort of unleavened diet of Boris Johnson flavoured analysis. I don't know whether I should apologise for that, but it's not every day that 100 and so thousand paid-up members of the Conservative Party get to choose our next Prime Minister. That's why we're focusing so much attention on it. We will no doubt return. I wanted to talk about royal cortèges. Is that the right word? Did I use it correctly? Today? Because where I live in West London, in Chiswick, one of my most Meldrewish developments lately has been quite a lot of crossness, and I've presumed it was Prince Harry and Meghan, because they live out Windsor way, right? Which means they'd go up past me to get there. And there've been loads lately, and they really, really mess you up. You know, the whistles, the bike outriders are blowing big whistles, and you get a bit jumpy, and the cars and the bikes are veering all over the place. And Mrs. O'Brien and I, because such is the sparkling nature of our marital repartee, Mrs. O'Brien and I have commented often in recent months on how someone's going to get hurt soon. These I only ever used to see them down by... Sorry, I'm alienating a significant swathe of my audience, aren't I? I'm about to give you a road-based anecdote in central... You know where Sainsbury's is, near Earl's Court, on that big crossover? There, for some reason. I'd always see the outriders there going past when I lived in Earl's Court, but I didn't see them that often. Chiswick lately, if you were a royal watcher, you should get a little deck chair, stick it on the A4. They're going past, they're like buses. You wait years for one to come along, and there's 17 of them in the space of a very short amount of time. But they are aggressive and borderline obnoxious, and I don't understand why they need it. Because they are not emergency workers, and it's not as if they're ever going to be late for anything, and even if they were late for it, they're members of the royal family. Everyone will pretend they're not. In the same way the Queen thinks that everywhere smells of fresh paint, because everywhere she goes it's just been freshly painted. No one is ever going to go, oh, sorry, Prince Harry, you've turned up to open a school, or you've turned up to open a museum, everyone's gone home, you're 20 minutes late. If they were presenting live radio programmes, I could understand why they needed this quasi-military accompaniment to get themselves through the city. And I'm making light of it, but there is a lady who is very, very poorly and might not pull through as a direct result of being hit by one of these outriders, which is part of the reason why we haven't talked about it, because as a phone-in topic, because it's more serious than perhaps some of my light-hearted analysis would currently allow. I really hope she gets better, but the story is serious and the problem is real, and I do appreciate that it's unlikely to be weighing too heavily on your mind if you're listening to this in Lytham St Anne's. But it's a big deal, and it gets on my nerves. Unlike Theo Usherwood, who's here with... we're going to have a little catch-up. We're going to end Mystery Hour early. I'm going to pretend it was all your fault, so all the complaints can be directed to you.
But, James, I did advocate for a full Mystery Hour.
Did you?
I did advocate.
Not with me, you didn't. I've decided that we're going to end it a little bit early.
I think it's not my fault.
Do you not think you should be coming in at 5 to 1?
No, I'll come in at 5 to 1.
Talking through what's going to happen later, because you don't have to. It's a great honour.
No, it's great. It's always an honour.
I can't believe that you were
I just don't want your listeners.
to be on my programme.
I don't want your listeners who love listening to Mystery Hour and putting the questions, to think that I have somehow curtailed Mystery Hour.
No, well, I have made that decision.
And it would only be your decision.
Very important to make that clear here. Absolutely.
Yes. Trouble looming for Nigel Farage's Brexit Party.
Oh,
James.
no. Oh, God, can today get any worse?
Because this is a story which you've pointed out to me has been overlooked in... given that we've had the Conservative leadership race this week, but you wanted me to go away and find out about it, so I've done exactly that, because the Brexit Party has been asked by the elections watchdog to account for every single donation it received in the run-up to last month's European elections. If I can explain briefly, any payment or offer of a good or service, advertising, for example, that is above £500, that's classed as a donation. If it's a donation, it has to come from a UK source, somebody who's registered on the electoral roll or a UK-based business. It cannot come from a foreign source. That would break the law. Now, of course, that rule is in place to prevent foreign powers influencing our electoral process, our elections.
Or just dodgy geezers. Doesn't have to be foreign powers. It could be mysterious American billionaires.
Yes. No, but yes. Now, what's happened during the European elections is that Nigel Farage's Brexit Party managed to amass a financial war chest of £2.5 million. That's a huge amount of money to pay for campaigning.
Not if you're David Davis. You thought £143 million was a drop in the ocean earlier this morning, but carry on.
It's a huge amount of money to raise in such a short space of time.
Yes.
And there were, of course, a handful of large donations running into thousands of pounds, all declared, and from what we understand, they all complied with the law. But, James, there were also thousands of donations less than £500. Now, under the law, they did not have to be declared. Indeed, the Brexit Party made it much easier for itself to comply with the Electoral Commission's law, because it was only possible on the party's website to give up to £500 towards Nigel Farage's European election effort. Now,
almost as if they thought they could deliberately avoid having to provide details of who.
Because you cap it at £500.
So if anyone had given £501, they knew they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it.
Oh. So whilst, and of course, many online.
This is getting curiouser and curious.
When you or Mrs. O'Brien, you do your shopping online, for example, you'll have to ensure you'll provide your billing address and a delivery address matched, and that's put in place to combat fraud.
Okay.
Anyone giving less than £500 to the Brexit Party, however, didn't have to provide that information. They didn't even have to provide a postcode. They could simply do it via PayPal.
So, in purely in the realms of theory, if I had £1 million and I had a control over a couple of Russian troll farms, they could just spend all day donating £500 without any traceability whatsoever.
Yes, basically. So
Nigel I didn't know that.
But Nigel Farage's party, and therefore the Electoral Commission, nobody knows the identity of those small donors.
Well, any of them?
No, because it's all done via PayPal. So unless...
So there's more probity involved in ordering my groceries from Sainsbury's than there is in donating money to an organisation that claims to be a political party?
If when you put your details into Sainsbury's, I mean, I shop on Amazon a bit.
Yeah.
I put my billing address
and the card address have to match up.
The billing address and the delivery address.
Yeah.
Or the billing address and your card have to match up.
That's right.
So they know your home address.
Gosh.
But it should, of course, be pointed out that if one of those donors, say, is French or Spanish or Italian, and they gave £490, that wouldn't break the law.
No.
But the Commission is fearing that wealthy interlopers, keen for the Brexit Party to do well in the European elections, may well have given multiple amounts of £490. Indeed, the Freedom of Information request released on Monday, the regulator said it feared foreign powers could have set up automated systems to donate £500 over and over and over again, with total donations running into thousands of pounds, and that would be a breach of the law. Louise Edwards, she's the Commission's Director of Regulation, and she told MPs earlier this week she'd asked the party to go back and try and find out the origin of all the money it had received.
At the moment, we see that they need to improve their processes quite significantly in that area because they're not collecting enough information to make those determinations.
So if they're not, so your view is, if they're not collecting people's addresses and proper information about whether the bank account is linked to the address, then actually they can't know whether that is a permissible donation or not. They can't know whether that is a British registered voter living abroad or whether it's just someone abroad.
It's a huge risk, yeah, and that's why one of the recommendations that we made, in fact the first recommendation we made, is that they need to go back and look at the payments that they have received over or under £500 and they need to satisfy themselves that they are sure those amounts of money are permissible, and if they are not, then they need to forfeit those amounts of money.
I think, in all fairness, we need to remind ourselves about what is really important and what isn't. Jokes about milkshakes and battery acid are obviously a hell of a lot more serious than the Electoral Commission suggesting that there's something distinctly problematical about the funding of a political organisation that's currently leading in the polls. Carry on here.
The Brexit Party faces a significant administrative task. It now has to go back through every donation and find out where the origin of that donation in every single case. It will amount to tens of thousands, potentially, of donations. Party officials will then need to cross-reference every single donation against the source of the money to find out if there have been multiple donations from the same source. That would break the law. If and where that has been the case, the money would then need to be forfeited, as you heard there from Louise Edwards when she was being questioned by the Conservative MP Damien Collins. But what's more, where the party cannot trace the source of the money, it will need to hand that money back to the watchdog, and then that money would go back to the Treasury. Now, the Brexit Party thinks it's been the victim of an establishment witch hunt.
The victim? Surely not. Carry on.
Bob Posner, the chief executive of the Electoral Commission, told the chairman of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, that's Mr. Collins, that the regulator's concern warranted a complete audit.
You don't believe they've kept records to be able to know for certain whether the donations are permissible or not?
Well, we are sufficiently concerned to say they need to do this work.
Yeah, so if there's a requirement on them to make sure they're only receiving money which is permissible, what you're saying is they're not collecting the information they would need to know whether this money is permissible or not.
Well, that's what they need to sort. That's absolutely right. Yes.
That was Bob Posner there being questioned by Damien Collins. I've been to the Brexit Party for a comment. A spokesman told me it's beginning to look like the regulatory part of the state is beginning to take sides.
Yada, yada, yada. Have they said anything about the actual allegations that have been levelled against them?
We will, of course, comply within reason, but some of the actions of the regulatory bodies go beyond reason.
Just to be clear, these aren't foreign regulatory bodies.
No, this is... They haven't...
I mean, I know that this organisation has a lot of problems with foreign rules and foreign regulatory bodies. This is an exclusively British authority, the Electoral Commission, that they're now whining and claiming victimhood about.
Yes, the Electoral Commission. I mean, the
spokesman... Did you make it clear that there weren't any foreigners involved in the Electoral Commission? This is a British institution upholding British regulations, rules and standards. I thought they cared. I mean, I don't have a lot of time for them, but I did at least think they cared about that sort of stuff.
No. I just said, what's your response? The regulatory body, which wasn't name-checked by the spokesman, it's safe to assume is the Electoral Commission.
Yes.
But they think that...
The British Electoral Commission.
The British Electoral Commission.
Which is literally protecting British democracy from potential corruption by foreign sources. In this case. Potential,
yes.
And they've still got a problem with that and claim that it's an establishment stitch-up or attack on... Well, I never. I'm going to have to do a bit of thinking. I can't quite see... Can you? Have you got... No. See? British rules, British democracy, British regulatory body, still talking about being victims of unfairness. Theo Usherwood has been playing a part in the political coverage on the programme, and he's here now to cue up the next chapter in this interesting period in British political history.
In the next 10 minutes, James, we will find out the latest Conservative leadership candidate to drop out. And it will be between Michael Gove and Sajid Javid. Now, if rumours of skullduggery are to be believed, we could expect proxy votes. That's where MPs do not vote in person, but give their vote to a friend or to their campaign team whip to place it on their behalf, to be put from the Boris Johnson camp into the box for Sajid Javid.
So that they get rid of Gove?
So that they get rid of Gove.
Because Gove is the one Johnson most fears facing in televised two one-on-one debates.
And Gove is the one that Johnson really hates and would like, we understand...
Hate's a bit strong, isn't it?
Well, after what happened in 2016, when
I'm with you. Sorry,
Michael Gove as his deputy,
I know,
and then left the campaign 45
This
minutes
is
before he
astonishing, and we sometimes gloss over it, I think, because we do it for a living. But as if the situation under which, the circumstances through which we're going to have our next Prime Minister appointed were not unfair and unrepresentative enough, you're now suggesting that even the parliamentary party, members of the parliamentary party, are conspiring to deny the grossly unfair tiny selectorate who've paid to be members of the Conservative Party from having a fair choice between two candidates, because otherwise, how on earth did Rory Stewart go down between the last two counts unless people who want Johnson to win voted for him to get rid of Raab, and then also, of course, it excuses you from having called it wrong because you didn't necessarily accommodate such skullduggery into your analysis, so you're off the hook as well. But now the plan would be give all your votes to Sajid Javid and we'll be waving goodbye to Michael Gove, because Johnson would most like to go up against Hunt in the debates, because Hunt is a little bit poor, perhaps, some may say, whereas Javid has got his eye as a former banker, he'd quite like to be Chancellor. Yep. So even in the context of utter unfairness and absence of proper democracy, even then Johnson's team is still trying to finagle and conspire.
So if Johnson gives his votes to Javid, it would be about hurting Michael Gove, about embarrassing and humiliating Michael Gove, because Michael Gove left his campaign, ditched Johnson with 2 hours before Boris Johnson was due to announce his candidacy and launch his campaign to be Prime Minister in 2016 after the referendum. Boris Johnson therefore turned up at a central London hotel and said, I'd really like to do this, but I can't because I don't have the support.
Nadine Dorries started crying.
Did she?
Yes.
You've got a better memory than me.
I know, it's a curse.
And so Nadine Dorries starts crying. Boris Johnson can't launch his campaign and he blames Michael Gove. And now is the chance for revenge, because it would be much greater revenge for Michael Gove to go out at this stage, the humiliation of going out at this stage.
To these people.
And then Sajid Javid makes it through to this evening, but then Boris Johnson would still want to face Jeremy Hunt. And so if there was any doubt about it, they'd lend votes to Hunt.
So what do you think is going to happen?
Prediction, if Boris Johnson decides to lash out and humiliate Gove, then Gove will go now and Javid will go this evening, and then it'll be a final two runoff with the membership between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt.
Which is a foregone conclusion anyway, but it spares the possibility of any blood being spilt in the process.
If it gets to
metaphorical blood, Nigel, don't phone the police.
If it gets to the end of that process mid-July and there is a vote of the membership of 160,000, Boris Johnson wins. If it doesn't get to a vote at that stage, then that would be because Boris Johnson, for some reason, has imploded.
We'll watch this space.